Jesus is talking about a wedding. This time he's talking about a wedding banquet. So this is the passage we're going to be looking at this morning. Jesus is having a conversation with the Pharisees again, the religious leaders of the day. And here's part of that conversation. Once more, Jesus spoke to them, the religious leaders, in parables. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to summon those invited to the banquet, but they didn't want to come. Again, he sent out other servants and said, "Tell those who are invited, see, I prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet." But they paid no attention and went away, one to his own farm, another to his business, while the rest seized the servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged, and he sent out his troops, killed those murderers, and burned down their city. Then he told his servants, "The banquet's ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go, then, to where the roads exit the city and invite everyone you find to the banquet." So those servants went out on the roads and gathered everyone they found, both evil and good. The wedding banquet was filled with guests. When the king came in to see the guests, he saw a man there who was not dressed for a wedding. So he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without wedding clothes?" The man was speechless. The king told the attendants, "Tie him up, hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen." Wedding banquets, like the one that we're going to experience today, the wedding feast, they can be a touchy thing. Sometimes they can get pretty expensive. New York Times ran a story, and this was about 30 years ago. They ran a story and ended up becoming national news, and you'll understand why here in a second. But the story was about a lady named Kathleen Gooley of Norwalk, Connecticut. Kathleen was supposed to get married in late June of 1990. But the wedding was called off after the groom decided not to go through with the wedding. There are other words. You're right. You're all sitting there thinking, yeah, there's other words we use for that, right? She was stuck with the bill for the catering hall. She was going to be out $4,000. Yeah, right. In 1990 numbers, right? So she and a friend started talking, probably talking about the groom. They started talking, and they came up with the idea, well, look, we've already, the catering hall already has our money. Let's go ahead and do something. And they did. So rather than walking away from the $4,000, she and some friends decided that they were going to throw a party. And they did. Instead of having a reception, Kathleen Gooley contacted homeless shelters, drug rehab facilities, and 150 people showed up and enjoyed that party. Several businesses donated flowers and favors for the party and provided transportation for the guests. And again, they enjoyed themselves $4,000 worth of food and dining for those who were down and the unfortunate. You know, all the guests got a hot meal. They had baked potatoes, they had chicken breasts, they had cake, they had ice cream. One of the homeless guests told the New York Times, "She made us feel like people again." It's an act of kindness through that party. Our story this morning is about a wedding banquet. And it's got a little bit in common with that, because the guests are the unexpected. The guests are the unwanted. Now, the Bible has a lot to say about weddings, and it has a lot to say about wedding banquets. We've looked at some of those passages this morning. Probably the most famous wedding banquet thousands of years ago was with a guy named Samson. Now, we're used to thinking about Samson being the strong guy, right? Well, Samson, he also ran into trouble, and he got upset with the town in which his in-laws were residents, and he burned down their fields and burned down their groves and burned down their vineyards, and yeah, it was a mess. Most of the stories of the wedding banquets, though, aren't like that. And there is a running theme through the Bible about a wedding banquet in which God himself is throwing the banquet, is throwing the feast. He throws big wedding feasts that he shares with his people. And Jesus is picking up on that theme here in our story, where God is involved in feasting with his people. And the imagery being used, the idea being used, is a wedding feast. Now, Jesus, as we said moments ago, is having a conversation with religious leaders. In fact, we're told just before this conversation happens, these very same religious leaders that he has this conversation with, they are plotting and planning to kill him. They want him arrested. What's interesting is Matthew, who's writing this, Matthew was one of Jesus' best friends, who was a witness to all of this. Matthew tells us that they wanted to arrest Jesus, but they couldn't because Jesus was quite a bit like a rock star. The people liked him. If they arrest Jesus, they got a problem on their hands because Jesus was so popular. And Jesus knows this. Jesus knows what they're up to. He knows what they're planning. He knows they want to arrest him. He knows that there's basically a bounty. They want to get rid of it. So Jesus tells this story. He tells this story to these religious leaders. These religious leaders who are supposed to be pastors and shepherds of the people. They're supposed to be the ones who understand grace and forgiveness and God's love and God's redemption. They're the ones that are supposed to know this. They're the ones that are supposed to be living like this. They are plotting to kill Jesus. Who tells the story? This king throws a wedding feast for his son who is getting married. And he invites those you would expect at a royal wedding. And who would you expect to be to be there at the king's table? Well, you'd expect the elite, right? You'd expect all the king's officers. You would expect to see those who are running in the business of running the nation. The who's who list. The elite class, those who are in the top 1%. And as you heard moments ago, as Jesus is telling the story, they all refuse to come. They refuse to show up. So, this king, throwing a wedding feast for his son, well, he fills up that banquet hall anyway. He says he fills it with guests. And ultimately, then, he lowers the boom on those who refused his invitation. And what's interesting is you follow this story on its way out. We're not going to get into all that happens after this. But the religious leaders aren't all that happy with this story. They know why Jesus is telling this story. They realize that Jesus is the son in the story. They are the bad guys. They're the ones refusing to show up. And Jesus is saying, you know what? You're all doomed. We're still going to have a party. It's just not going to include you. So, as we gather today to celebrate CJ and Cassie, as we think about weddings and enjoy a wedding feast that's coming, let's look at this story again. Jesus is telling us something that we need to see, even as we celebrate with Cesar and Cassandra this morning. First thing we need to see is what Jesus opens the story with is the kingdom of heaven is like a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. The kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is compared to a wedding feast. The kingdom of heaven where God rules and reigns over his people. The plans that God has for his people. In fact, from the beginning of time. This running theme of kingdom, from the opening pages of our Bibles to the very end, God is comparing it to a wedding feast. All of world history could be summed up using this idea of a wedding feast. A marriage, a bride, a groom, a celebration, making merry, a time of dancing, a feast with lots of food and drink, all of it. All of it part of this wedding feast idea. All of world history summed up with food and an occasion. Have we ever thought about a wedding feast as being a picture of God's kingdom here on earth? The whole thing is a picture of God's relationship with his people. This is who God is for his people. This is what he does for his people. Time and again throughout the Bible, God's grace and kindness for his people who live in his kingdom, pictured as being a wedding feast. From the beginning of time to the end of time, the kingdom of heaven is a wedding feast. And the religious leaders, they know this. They know their Bibles. They know this. They know that the kingdom has often been compared to a wedding feast. They understand that when God talks about his relationship to his people, that he's often talking about in terms of feasting and celebration and merriment, because that's what God wants to do with his people. It's what he was doing with Adam and Eve in the garden before they decided to turn the tables. So Jesus' story here about this wedding feast and using them as players in this isn't so good for them. Jesus is making them look bad. They know this. The next thing we see here is that the king sends servants. It says he sent his servants. Again, Jesus is giving them, he's giving them a story. This is their story. These servants here that have on their lips the invitation from the king, constantly inviting people into the wedding feast. God has been doing this with his servants throughout history. Between the priests, the prophets, you think about Moses, you think about Elijah, you think about Isaiah, you think about Jeremiah, they're constantly talking about how God wants relationship with his people and inviting them in. He sends the servants. Now, the feasts of those days, by the way, they were something spectacular. Even the ones that are in the small towns and villages. It is something to be, usually about at least 7 days. If you had money, they probably lasted longer. But at least 7 days. And it always got better. Every day there was some music. Every day there was some feasting. And as the week went on, the food gets better. The celebrations last longer. The wine gets better. We got that story also in our Bibles. It all gets better. Finally, on that last day, that's when the whole thing, that's when the whole celebration comes to a conclusion, but it's always spectacular. That's when, we would think of it as, that's when the fireworks start, right? 7 days of feasting. The king is sending his servants to invite people in to this grand feast that he's providing. This is what God has been doing with his people all along. Inviting them into relationship with him. Because God pictures relationship with his people as celebration. He delights. We're going to be talking about this starting next week. He delights in his people. He wants to do this with his people. And he's glad when his people get together and celebrate with him. And so he sends servants with the invite. The servants are inviting guests. Guests who it would be expected to be part of this celebration. The invite is pretty plain. It's very simple. You don't even have to do anything. It's unconditional. Here's the invite. Come to the wedding banquet. Come to the wedding banquet. Come and enjoy all the benefits of my kingdom. Come and see and taste all that I plan to provide for you. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to pay anything. Just come. Just receive the invitation. And God is offering to give the best. The best of the music, the best of the wine, the best of the dancing, the best of the celebration, the best of the food. It's all there. All you have to do is come to the banquet. Come to the feast. It's right in the invitation. It's in this invitation, by the way, you start to sense that the story is about to turn on those who are listening in, these religious leaders. You see, these religious leaders understand themselves to be those who would be expected at this banquet. They're among the top 1%. These are the ones that have all the conferences. These are the ones you find on Instagram as influencers. They drive the fancy cars. You know, they are into mega ministry. They write the books. They have the TV programs. They expect to be among the honored guests. But this is where the story goes. Jesus finally says, they paid no attention. They paid no attention. They paid no attention, and they seal their own doom. They seal their own doom. And these religious leaders are doing a slow burn up to this point, but you can start to see where the wheels come off of this story. And then, it's amazing that they allow Jesus to finish the story at this point. They've spent their entire lives expecting to be at this grand feast that God is always talking about. They've read the stories, they've heard the prophets, they know it's coming, they expect to be there. At the very end of the Bible, in fact, we've got that at the very end of our Bibles. There's this grand feast where Jesus is going to feast and celebrate with his bride, the church. And these guys expect to be there. They seem to be shoo-ins for the invite. They have all their ducks in a row with God. They've got it. They are the morally upstanding. They got their act together. Their lives are circumspect. They have a hot line to God, except there's one little itsy-bitsy problem. They want God, they want this feast without Jesus. They don't want Jesus, they don't want the Son. They don't want the Son. The king's throwing the banquet for the Son. They don't want the Son. They just want the banquet. They just want the feast. They're not interested in grace. They're not interested in forgiveness. They want Moses. They want Moses punching their ticket on their way to paradise. And Jesus here is saying, if you don't want the Son, then you're not invited at all. If you don't want the Son, then doom is your fate. This is not going to end well for you if you don't want the Son. And here's why then, though, the story has much grace. A lot of grace. Here's the shocker of it all. And again, knowing how these religious leaders responded to other things that Jesus has said along the way, this is the final nail in the coffin. And this is why, you see in the very next few verses, they go running off to figure out how they're going to finally get Jesus. Here it is. The wedding banquet was filled with guests. The wedding banquet was filled with guests. Those who refused the invitation, well, that didn't stop the king. Those who refused the Son, that's not going to stop the feast. The wedding banquet was filled with guests, and Jesus says in the story that he's talking about that it's the evil and the good. It's everybody. And he says, go to the edge of the city. You know who you find at the edge of the city? Those who we would say are down on their luck. Those who are disenfranchised. Those who are vulnerable. Those who, as Matthew describes elsewhere, those are the sinners. The drunks. The one that society has cast off. You know why they end up there is because they're all about the Son. Why not? The Son is offering grace. The Son is offering forgiveness. This feast is full. It's full. Don't miss that word filled. Filled. Filled with guests. Guests who aren't supposed to be there. Guests who don't deserve to be there. The great steak, the great wine, the music, the dancing, it's for those who know they don't deserve it. Those who know they need the grace. The wedding feast was filled. It was filled with people who don't have the best behavior. It wasn't with those who are worthy. It wasn't for those who look and smell like success. The wedding feast is filled with strangers, foreigners. That's scandalous. It's filled with those who know they have no business being at the king's table. And it's filled. You know, we're used to, when we see that word filled, we're used to thinking about that word filled like filling a container. When Matthew uses this word filled throughout it, he's talking about it not just filling the container, but it's overflowing. Like the container can't hold it all. Like this banquet hall is not going to hold everyone who shows up to the feast. It's going to be spilling to overflowing. That's how great grace is. That's how great forgiveness is. The wedding feast will not be for those who think they've done enough good. The wedding feast is not for those who think that they've checked all the morality boxes. That wedding feast is for sinners. People that know they need grace and forgiveness. The religious leaders walk out of this and they're angry. They want nothing of the Son, and they are bent on the Son's destruction. And in a few short weeks, they get their way. It does happen. Jesus dies. But the amazing thing about this, come back to this story, this banquet hall, this feast is filled with those for whom the Son dies. The Son dies to fill the feast. The feast will be full of people who know that they need